Yeah. All right. So I think if we count from the beginning, this would be episode 11.
Oh, all right, we're
So
doing that.
yeah, it's a good place to start off again. 1-1.
Yeah,
Um,
1.1.
yeah, and we're gonna talk about coffee. I don't really have like a nice preamble or
Mm.
introduction, but you wanted to talk about genetics and metabolism, and I guess we'll just go from there.
Yeah, I don't actually know that much about coffee. Um, like I don't know significantly more than probably the average like Ray Peat or somebody else that has looked into coffee being healthy.
Yeah,
Um, I know it has like polyphenols and
tannins.
several of
Yeah,
those are antioxidant. I think actually I opened up a paper and I was surprised, like even compared to green tea, which is the second highest, it has almost twice the polyphenol content in measured milligrams per 100 mils of, I guess, actual beverage.
mm,
So I guess it's possible that you could make super strong green tea and super weak coffee and get those to parity. But I guess like your average coffee beverage has 200 milligrams per 100 milliliters of just total polyphenols. It doesn't break it down past that. And green tea is at 115, and then black tea is a little bit below 100, and things go down from there. Um, but yeah, the genetics thing, what that I thought was interesting is, so the Ray Peat perspective, is that I think if I remember correctly, people with a good metabolism and a well functioning liver can tolerate coffee. And by
yeah,
tolerate, like get energized from it, but not get too wired and not be unable to sleep like several hours after having drank it.
yeah.
And
I think that's actually Georgie. I think that's his thing. I don't know if Pete has said that. He might have.
yeah, I think he has, but yeah, if not, I mean, it's in that world. So, and I think that that's true. And then just to give the other side, not that this is like much of a formal debate right now in the space, like sugar or anything. There's really no coffee caffeine wars going on. But actually, I remember in a class that I had back in like 2013, one of the professors, it was the kind of class where there's a different professor every week or almost every week. And he was talking about 23andMe because he was, I don't know if he was a professor or he was, it doesn't really matter, but he was like overseeing building a new building for health sciences and biomedical at Rutgers. And he was somehow involved with like genetic stuff. And so he was big on, because back in 2013, 23andMe was, there was a period of time after 2013 and before now that actually you couldn't do it. Do you remember that?
Oh, did they change the regulations again?
Yeah. Something happened where it came out in like 2011 or
Yeah, I
I don't
think
know.
the idea was like the FDA prohibited them from like basically analyzing the data.
Right. So you could get just basically your ancestry and like some trivial things.
Well, I mean, you would have the data there, but then you would have to export it to
Right.
another service. Like,
Yeah.
uh, yeah,
And
there
I
are
think
several.
that got changed again at some point after that time so that the website can tell you some things, like even some dramatic things like that. You have to click OK, but like the breast cancer one, which I
Oh
think is
yeah,
the really
yeah,
significant one. Uh, so anyway, this guy was talking about how he was just giving an example, like, oh yeah, I did 23andMe and it helped me learn about myself, and like I could always drink a lot of coffee, and I know a lot of people can't, and I can just drink a lot of coffee and go right to sleep. And sure enough, I had, you know, 2 copies of the whatever fast coffee metabolizing gene. So I was like, oh, cool. I'll look that up because I did 23andMe. And uh, the first thing I noticed was that 23andMe kind of sucks. Like what they tell you about your stuff it's not even the thing. Like if you look up coffee metabolism and genes, it's the CYP1A2 variant, one of the cytochrome P450 enzymes, that is the thing that people talk about. But the one that they just tell you right off the bat on 23andMe is this other stuff that's like regulating the amount of that protein that gets made instead of the actual variant of the protein,
Oh,
something. So it's literally like, imagine if what you cared about, what, like it was like, oh, eye color genetics, and then it tells you like, oh, your eyes are likely to be light colored, but then you have to go into the raw data to find the variants to say what you're like, how many blah blah blahs you have for like blue or brown or whatever. So I had to go into the raw data, is what I'm saying, and I and I had to find this stupid freaking thing. Um, so it ends up that I am homozygous for fast metabolism of caffeine.
oh, well, congratulations.
Thank you. So I can't really speak to. So I have, I could probably count on my fingers the amount of times that I remember um, being kept up at night from something like coffee. Like it just doesn't. Like I remember having a feeling a couple times in my life where like my heart was kind of racing, like
Hmm.
a low level anxiety feeling, and I just felt like, wow, I don't feel sleepy. I don't feel like I can sleep right now, and I want to go to sleep, and I feel like I can't do it. And I think that maybe, I don't know why, but that happens very rarely. And I'll drink coffee really late. Like I'll drink coffee at midnight or something, or 11 p.m., and then go to sleep at like 1 a.m. and
Oh,
not feel like there's an issue there.
do you wake up like in the middle of your sleep then?
No, not really.
Oh, because I think that's what happens to me. Um, because when they're like on the weekends, sometimes I will have coffee later, like at 2 or 3 in the afternoon, and I won't have any problem going to sleep, but I will wake up at like 2 or 3:30 in the after or in the morning, and then I won't be able to go to sleep for like 2 hours. That's
And that
something
only
that
happens when you drink the coffee.
that's what I've connected it to. I mean, there's always, many different variables. Like I'm just, swapping in, swapping out like different supplements and stuff like that. Um, but I think that's something that I'm evaluating, paying attention to.
Hmm. That's a really long time for the effect.
Yeah, well, I think what's weird though is that like I go to sleep just fine, but then I wake up. Like that doesn't follow the narrative at all.
Right.
The idea is that you're anxious and you don't want to go to sleep, you know. And that's another thing too that we should talk about is that I think a lot of the negative reactions that people have to coffee are basically because they're undernourished.
Hmm. Yeah.
Like you should have coffee with a meal with
Hmm.
protein and carbohydrates. Um, and like I haven't had any problems with that. I think like Dave Asprey has become very famous for bulletproof coffee and saying that that coffee beans are really there's a high amount of like fungal mycotoxin exposure with a lot of coffee beans worldwide, and his beans are supposed to be free from that, and so then you won't have any sort of negative reactions. You won't get the jitters or have to like pee right away. And I think a lot of people would avoid um, or wouldn't have any problem if they just you know didn't drink their coffee black and they had it with a meal.
Hmm. Right. So that's more of the Ray P perspective, which is that caffeine in particular, coffee is like an accelerant of
Yeah, it
metabolism.
like upregulates your metabolism. Oh, and there was
Right.
another thing too. I was trying to find because I think I saw a quote somewhere in like the Ray Pito sphere. I think it was on Instagram. I was trying to track it down, but I like somebody was. like Ray Pete or somebody else had a quote saying that caffeine is like not a stimulant. Actually, they're making a case for it, and I don't know what that case was. That's why I wanted to find that again. I just thought that was really interesting because pretty much everybody you talk to will say that caffeine is a stimulant.
Yeah, I think formally it has to be considered a stimulant, like to the point where there have been a lot of studies on athletic performance and stuff like that, and significant effects have been found. I think there's plenty of room for debate over how it works, like and in what cases it stimulates in a sort of pro performance way, and in what situations it could like not be good for performance. And maybe there's these genetic variations too.
Yeah.
Uh,
So what qualifies as a stimulant? Like what kind of definition would you use?
hmm. I should have looked and saw what like some of the endpoints are from those studies. But to me, I guess it would be increasing the respiratory rate. Like a
Yeah.
lot of times when you take a substance, or if you don't eat for a while and then you eat a meal, um, most people can feel a difference in their body temperature. And occasionally I will notice a difference in my breathing rate or like my heart rate.
Mm.
Um, Especially if it's like some days I'm really bad, and I'll like on the weekends I'll sleep in really late and I'll just unintentionally fast for a long time, and I'll like get up and do a few things and just not have as a priority to get any nutrition for a while.
Yeah.
And on days like that, when I'll like finally either make myself something or go out and I'll have like a cup of coffee and a meal, on those days I can often feel like almost like in my heart, like I'll start to feel it like, I guess because the difference is
Yeah.
bigger.
Yeah.
I can feel the strength of the heartbeats. That's weird.
Yeah. I understand.
So I think
Um
that's formally measured, and I think you could probably measure oxygen consumption in a enclosed environment with a stimulant.
okay. So basically anything that stimulates the metabolism. That's what you would call a stimulant.
Yeah, and so most of that, like something like a meal, is a more of a long-term stimulant and like a lower chronic, whereas a drug like a
Cocaine.
methamphetamine or a cocaine, yeah, that would be like a short term and a more
Yeah.
powerfully acute. But like, yeah, the respiratory rate would go up, the heart rate would go up, stuff like that, oxygen consumption.
Okay. I guess yeah, I can see how yeah, caffeine would fit under that. Um but speaking about like being warm and having a warm body temperature, I mean that's one of the reasons why I have started to have so much coffee and tea is because these are hot liquids. You heat up the water um, when you're preparing them, and then that hot water is going into your body and heating you up. And um, more importantly, your stomach, your body doesn't have to heat up the food in order to process it. It's
Mhm.
already hot. Um, and actually, I didn't get to research this beforehand, but I think like Ray Pete has talked about, um, the classic pigs in sweaters and how they have like better their fat
Yeah,
ratios like more saturated and stuff like that.
I think poultry too.
Yeah, I'm sure like any kind of food. Um, and so yeah, that's been a focus of mine over the past couple months is basically just um allowing my environment to like taking sort of I guess external heat and using it in my body. And so like I dress warmer and have a lot of like warm foods, warm liquids, like soup. I don't really like eat like even now like when I have like orange juice cold from the fridge. I don't like that. That's
Yeah,
it's
me
weird to me.
neither. That happened a while ago because I stopped drinking soda when I was a kid.
Yeah.
Um, and because of that, like, because soda is one of those beverages that people
Yeah.
really get ice in. And I just got out of the habit of having ice in my drinks. And ever since then, like, it's not like I hate it, but yeah, I don't have that desire for a
Like something super cold.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, when I make lunch for myself for at work, I don't put I put it all in lunchbox, and then I don't put like any like ice packs or anything in there. And
Mhm.
so it's like slowly warming up to like room temperature. And right now that's not a big deal because it's still pretty cold outside and I basically work outside. Um but yeah, I prefer that. I don't really like eating things at like refrigerator temperature. And I was eating with my family last week, and people had you know glasses of water with ice, and just like the idea of that just kind of like I was like that just seems like so barbaric. Like why would you do this? And
Yeah, I think
actually,
that's something that people get into the habit of because
yes,
I
I think
remember
it
really liking that as a kid.
yeah. And I wonder if it's like not some kind of like dopamine thing maybe, or some kind of like endorphin type thing, but maybe not. But like my grandma, she talked about like having like fresh fruit, like freshly picked fruit. So obviously it's like outside in nature, probably warmed by the sun, and like how much nicer that is than just like pulling like a peach or an apple out of the fridge and having it be incredibly cold. And I think like milk too. I was also experimenting with that last year's, is heating up milk
Hmm.
um instead of just like having it cold. And yeah, I don't know. That's what I got to say for that. I mean, as far as like um other methods of like enhancing body heat sort of like externally, I've also been experimenting with infrared lamps a lot. Like I have them over my bed now, and so I'll kind of just like lay under them naked and just have all of that infrared energy hit me, and then I'll do that like in the morning too, sometimes if I remember. Um,
Hmm.
and then if people, I'm thinking about getting one of these shirts. But Matt Blackburn turned me onto this. He likes this company for infrared stuff, or like red light stuff. We'll say Gemba Red or Gemba Red. And they sell this shirt which has like this um, kind of like ceramic fabric. It basically reflects infrared, so it'll reflect your own body heat back at you,
Okay.
and so people can check that out.
Yeah, so I feel like we're uh, implicitly countering Wim Hof
Yeah.
methodology, which is another thing that, like, in the Ray perspective, like his and you explicitly countered what's his name, Dave Asprey, which I hate that guy. The first time I saw him, like, I think um, somebody I was just like with somebody, and they were like, oh, they were just very mildly into health and nutrition stuff, and they started following him. This is like probably 2013, and immediately I saw his stuff, and I was like, it was like Coney 2012. I felt the marketing. Like, Dave Asprey is like 90% marketing,
Oh yeah.
and it's so obvious to somebody that like has an eye for that or has been around like health stuff for a while. And he looks bad. The guy
Yeah.
looks like
Yeah. I don't like to play that game, but I mean, you gotta.
right. Yeah.
It's true. Like yeah, you.
If you're
There,
spending millions of dollars a year and your entire life is about you living forever and like anti-aging,
yeah, you should not look like shit.
right? You have to like hit, and I'm not saying like he's ugly or anything like that. And I know like some people like lose their hair, maybe that's partially genetic, like not even stuff like that, but stuff that's much more like his muscle tone. I remember one time when I was getting ready to like talk with Danny Roddy or something, and he wanted to talk about Dominic D'Agostini, who's this guy who's like a researcher at I think
Yeah.
University of South Florida or somewhere in Florida, and he's like really muscular, and he's a keto person, and he was doing an interview with Dave Asprey, and Dave Asprey's like, "Oh, I've been working out," and he like makes a muscle, and it was like, you know, in the cartoons where like it's like
It
like
goes
the
down. Yeah.
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 Or like, you know, when people, not necessarily when people have small muscles, but their muscle tone looks poor.
Yeah.
Like there's just, because you can have somebody with smaller muscles, but everything's like tight. Like
Yeah.
Robert De Niro in Taxi Driver.
No, I haven't
Um,
seen that, but
like somebody that just does like push-ups or something, and they
yeah,
don't,
like a lot of like body weight calisthenic type
yeah,
exercises.
or just somebody who's naturally, yeah, whatever, and you can kind of tell, and yeah, just stuff like that. But anyway,
I mean,
every
like, yeah, similar to that. Like, I with the muscle tone thing, I actually noticed this when I was kind of like veering towards vegetarianism for like a very brief moment last year, that I was like losing muscle tone.
mm,
Like to me, I like looked like I was kind of like losing a little bit of weight, but I didn't really like it because like, yeah, there's no tone, and I think that's like why Arnold Schwarzenegger, like if you've ever like seen pictures of him now, like all of like all of the muscularity that he used to have is just like all deflated. It's like these like deflated balloons on his body,
yeah.
and it almost kind of like makes you hesitant to like develop muscle if that's what it's gonna look like.
Yeah, I do think that most people that get anywhere near that level, it's a there's no soft landing like
Yeah.
after you get old. There is one guy though, he
Well, I
was
think
on Joe
he is.
Rogan.
Schwarzenegger is like vegetarian now, isn't he? Or he certainly like promotes a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, because he's like an environmentalist now.
Yeah.
But do you know the guy? He's from England, and he was Mr. Olympia for a while before Ronnie Coleman. Oh man, what's his name? Dorian Yates. He was on Joe Rogan like a year ago or something, and he is probably in his 50s now or something, and he's been retired for a while, and he's like come down in size to like a manageable, like normal big guy level. Like he still works out and stuff.
Yeah.
And he's one of the only guys I've ever seen come down from that like monster, like 250 or more pound bodybuilder body to a normal body without looking like they've got some weird suit, like
this
puffy.
this like flesh suit hanging off them.
Yeah. But what do you think about Wim Hof? Just to,
Um,
or have you not
I
really?
mean, like when I was into Jack Cruz a few years ago, about like 2014 to 2016, I was paying attention to his stuff, and that was kind of, I think, the peak of his popularity, or maybe that's just because what it seemed like to me, because that's when I was paying attention to him. Um, but I don't know. I think he's yeah. I don't really know how to explain it. I think it's I like it. It's kind of interesting because he's kind of like a Western, like Tibetan monk. Like,
Mhm.
like on the Eastern tradition, they'll have like these Tibetan monks or like these Indian yogis that can like do like these incredible, like scientifically inexplicable feats. And Wim Hof is like a Western representative of that. And so I think that's cool. Um, but yeah, I haven't looked into his stuff and I don't really know how to explain it. Partly because like I think a lot of it has to do with like um carbon dioxide,
Mm.
and I just don't have a good grasp on how that works, because I know it's like super tricky how that works, like in your blood and whatnot. Taking like sodium bicarbonate and then like it like turns into whatever in your blood. I just don't have a good grasp on that, and so
Yeah, my take on what he's doing, because he like does hyperventilation and stuff,
yeah, so carbon dioxide,
like
and
getting
yeah,
rid
from
of
the peat perspective, that that's exactly what you don't want to do
Right.
because you're exhaling all that carbon dioxide.
Yeah, so I think what he's doing is the equivalent of like hyper mega caffeine on an empty stomach. So he's like inducing a cortisol response, or I guess a general stress response. And it works. Like that's powerful stuff. And it short term increases your metabolism, like your body temperature. And he like fights off infections. Like he does those kind of miracle things where he like,
Yeah, they like inject him with some
yeah,
kind of
yeah.
infection.
Yeah. And that's totally like, yeah, if you could up like artificially up your cortisol and cytokines and sort of like bad stuff, but that stuff
Yeah,
does fight infection. The thing is, though, I wouldn't be surprised if he just drops dead like
yeah,
instantly at some point, like in his, ways he's probably in his late 50s or early 60s now.
yeah. I think like late 50s.
He also, the other thing is, he has kind of a big nose. And if you look at it, one of the tells that of this theory of what he's doing is it's very like red, like there's a lot of blood vessels,
Uh,
um, which happens to some people, like people that chronically drink and some other things. And I think what he's doing is all of this stress and the cortisol that he's calling upon all the time for these feats. He's like downstream causing this cascade that stimulates angiogenesis,
yeah,
new blood vessel formation,
yeah,
and you can see it because it's superficial in the nose. And yeah, I think he's really setting himself up. Like he's sort of like if you drink, if you do the bulletproof coffee, it works like
yeah,
on the most basic level. If you get up in the
yeah,
morning,
yeah. You get
you
that
don't need
mental
anything.
clarity.
Right. You get this like stress, like a cold shower, like a
Yeah,
slap in the face of
yep,
frozen water. That does work to instantly increase your concentration. And it lasts for like, I don't know, some amount of time. But if you do that over and over again, like, so you're doing that and you're calling on your liver and all of these different things, but mostly that to provide you with this energy in a quick emergency way, and you're
yeah,
not supporting it.
yeah. Well, it's like you're drawing from a reserve,
Right.
and yeah, the problem I think is with a lot of the keto, carnivore, and stuff like that is people are basically drawing from a kind of metabolic reserve to heal themselves, and that's a problem when you're doing that long term. That's what I tell people. I was like, well, in 10 years we can see what it looks like, but I mean
Yeah. Like,
that's kind of like hand waving things away.
yeah, the more you draw into those reserves, like whether it's through some type of technique or like a stress producing thing like fasting, you're it's like you're pulling like literal life energy, out of these like organs and gland systems.
Yeah,
And as you keep doing it, like you can't put it, but like on a superficial level, your liver, has a certain amount of glycogen, has a certain amount of all kinds of things, and those things can be replenished. But you set up this situation where when you're chronically doing that, it creates like a more and more hardwired cellular communication system that becomes more fragile. It's like there's just only so many times you can do it.
yeah.
And the response gets weaker over time, which is another reason why there's this paper that floats around where they say you get a
I just
stronger cortisol response.
I just want to jump in real quickly because I have like this like visual metaphor. Like if you ever like
Mhm.
held like a balloon or like something with air in it underwater,
Mhm.
and then you like let go, and then it just kind of like shoots up out of the water. It's
Mhm.
kind of like that's not really working. But I would say that's just this idea of like, yeah, I'm sorry,
Well,
forget I
okay.
said
I mean,
that.
I think
I
I
do
see where
have,
you're going with
but I
that.
do have another point that I want to make is like, yeah, so you're drawing on this like reserve. In like Kate Shanahan has this really great book that I like, where she basically talks about like the Weston A. Price diet, like eating like traditional foods. I don't know if she like specifically says she's like Weston A. Price, but definitely like traditional foods. And another thing that I really like about her book is that she talks about like facial structure, and not just in like a 2D symmetrical way. There's like it's a lot more complex. And so people who are like into like facial beauty, like that's very popular right now with like the mewing
Hmm.
and stuff like that. People should check that out. Um, but she has this concept of genetic wealth, which is kind of like epigenetic wealth, like Pottinger's cats. Are you
Hmm.
familiar with Pottinger's cats?
Yeah.
Yeah, so like um he would take these cats, and after like 4 generations of this inappropriate diet, they wouldn't be able to reproduce. And then he would put them on the proper diet, and then it would take 5 generations for them to reach the health that they originally had, because each generation is kind of like ratcheting up a step on this like genetic wealth ladder. And so I think you see this a lot with like athletes, or just like there's like people who are like, you just like can't explain like how they're able to just like eat crap, look great, and
Hmm.
just like, they just don't take care of themselves. They stay up forever, like drink alcohol, and they still can do everything better than you, and you're like struggling, and stuff like that. And it's because they have like this tremendous reservoir of genetic wealth. And actually, I think it's why, um, like people of, I think it's actually why we're gonna get racist here. Um, African Americans are generally better athletes, is because they are kind of like closer to that like ancestral diet. They're only like 400, 500 years away from basically like living on, according to the paleo people, what was the ideal,
Hmm.
diet, whatever that is, living as a hunter gatherer and whatnot. They're only like 400, 500 years removed from that. Or not even for many of them, maybe like 200, 300 years.
Hmm.
Um, Compare that to like most Europeans, and you know, it's a
Yeah, who
thousand
have had
years,
some kind of
like
agriculture.
several, yeah, 2,000 years and something like that. So
Right.
I think that could explain why a lot of African Americans, tend to make such great athletes.
Yeah, you might be able to do a study of Europe like at a gradient from south to north, because I think agriculture would have come later to the north. So that would be interesting to see like if there was more athletes, say, out of like Nordic or Germanic populations, and then as you get into like Central and then South Europe, and then into like Greece and stuff. But yeah, I think there's a genetic component to that too, in the sense that like European, like, or just like Western countries, for ever since I guess the turn of the 19th to 20th century, have had really low infant mortality. So like people that absolutely would just have died of uh,
Uh huh.
likely infection, um, or like infection aided along with some type of deficiency of like a nutrient or something, like those people are alive.
Yeah.
And so they're kind of like part of the pot. Whereas a population that more recently started having access to, say, just antibiotics or something, they would have less. They would have had this like really, really harsh natural selection from infection and stuff like that, closer to modern times.
Yeah. Well, and that also actually feeds into this epigenetic wealth thesis, because those people, those kind of like edge cases, of survival, not survival, well, now they're surviving, but they're kind of like just on the edge. It's going to be a lot harder for them to build up their epigenetic wealth.
Hmm.
And at the same time, I mean, they're probably not, because a lot of like modern things tend to, you know, they don't build it up. They kind of take it away.
Yeah, we're not in
And
like a
and
health
yeah,
building
yeah, people,
situation.
yeah, I think very few people are building any kind of epigenetic wealth right now.
Right. So, yeah, it's just speaking of like Wim Hof and all that stuff, I think, and the Dave Asprey, the Bulletproof Coffee, that they're selling this thing that it's a parlor trick kind of. It's like, oh, look what I can do. Like I can look how big of a something something I can stick in my something something. Like, that doesn't make it healthy, you know. It's
Yeah,
like the human body can do a lot of things that are impressive, and a lot of those things also happen to like hurt the body, especially if you do them over time. Uh,
yeah. Well, and like this like specimen competition. I guess you could call it like War of Champions, kind of, where like the vegans will always roll out like Rich Roll or whatever his name is, like the vegan like super athlete, as an example of, see, it's possible and whatnot. It's like yeah, so you found, and he's might be a great example of this like genetic wealth thesis,
mhm.
that yeah, like his ancestors were, they built up such a tremendous reservoir for him to draw from, and so he's able to do these things as, on a vegan diet.
Yeah. Um, so bringing it back to the genetics versus the metabolism thing, I've seen this in the Ray Peat like community for a while, where I think there's a misunderstanding where now I'm going to speak for Ray here, but just so he's like quite a bit older than just about everybody that follows his work.
Yeah,
In some cases, like
yeah,
a lot older. And when he was coming up,
yeah.
he
He's
was
like
coming,
80 something.
yeah, something like that. So when he was coming up, epigenetics was not like, I think epigenetics became sort of accepted by the academy in the 90s. There had been studies like epidemiological studies that showed that, if a woman was like one underwent starvation during gestation, it would have a negative effect. But the actual mechanism, like, and not to say that formal epigenetics explains all of the possible mechanisms, but there was no real accepted, like, okay, we can point to the molecule that's changed or whatever until that. But anyway, and well before that, like basically, I think in the early 1900s, there was this idea, the neo-Darwinian idea, that you have your genetic blueprint. And if a baby just survives to birth, like it doesn't matter if the woman's like beaten, starved, crappy conditions, and even if the baby is starved and everything's awful, if the thing doesn't die and then it gets adequate nutrition, like at any point in its life, it'll just fulfill its genetic blueprint regardless. Like there's no um, windows where it's like, oh, you didn't get the right nutrients here. Now you can't like express these genes. Like they just kind of thought of it as like, this is your genetic blueprint. And if you're physically held back calorically from building up your body weight, then you will be underweight. But as soon as you're fed adequate nutrition, you'll just go to the body weight you would be genetically, you know? And
Hmm.
there's just sort of this like, it's like you're building a car and, oh, we don't have enough steel. Okay, we got the steel. And then like you finish the car and it's the same way as the car would have been if you got the steel last week.
Yeah,
Because
it's
like
like genetic determinism.
yes,
You're
a
you're
hundred
de-
percent genetic
yeah,
determinism.
you're determined to be what your genes say you are.
Right. So I think what I'm saying is that the reaction. So I think Ray is talking in reaction to that. So he's saying like that genes don't determine these things, and then because other people came up in a world where epigenetics is well accepted and the effect of nutrition in gestation and early life and all this kind of stuff is accepted, they hear him say that, and then they think like genes literally don't do anything. It's like in the case of coffee. Uh, I think that it's just true that this genetic variant probably does make a difference in people's ability to metabolize coffee, but it's also true. See, what this doesn't explain, and I've seen this in people, is that somebody gets older and then all of a sudden they can't drink coffee the way they used to anymore. Now that is not explainable genetically
Yeah.
from a pure, like I have two copies of the good
Yeah.
caffeine metabolizing gene, like I should have that for life. And then they hit 60 or something, and if they drink coffee after 5 p.m., they can't sleep, whatever.
Yeah. My
So,
understanding is that like the genes are they code for the proteins, the enzymes, and those are like the different tools that your body has to work with. Sometimes you get a tool that is better at doing a specific job, and sometimes you don't. And then also the other thing about epigenetics is like how often those like the I guess like the quantity that those tools are produced at.
mhm.
And
Yeah,
yeah.
it's like such a complex thing, but I guess it's just it's a shame that things tend to like dichotomize, um, and just that you can't, like, it almost seems impossible to, because it is true that there are a lot of people on the genetic side of things that kind of aren't interested in hearing something that's not genetic. There's also, in publishing right now, you can get things published because genetics is still new enough that if you just do a big study, like say you had access to 23andMe data and you did a big study on some disease or some even a non-disease outcome, like something athletic, or the ability to digest a food, and you found a correlation with like a certain genetic thing, like you could just get that published, and you're just sort of finding these like broad population things. And but at the individual level, like, so on the population level, a lot of things average out. So you might show like, okay, look, 90% of people that have this SNP at this, like, the CYP1A2 or whatever protein, they report that they can drink coffee and sleep. And like, only 10% of the people that have it don't report that. But that doesn't really, like, what you really need to do after that is like maybe follow those people throughout life, to, but so the genetic people are kind of stuck in this thing where I guess the formal academia is more on the genetic side right now, and their main incentive is to like publish papers. And the easiest thing to show with numbers and stuff is just kind of mathematically correlate something. And then the more therapeutic people, so more so people that are not in academia and are into
Yeah.
like things you can actually do.
Yeah, clinical alternative health and stuff like that.
Yeah,
They have an incentive to believe in the epigenetic stuff because that's their whole business is that we're going to change things about you.
right. And they kind of don't want to. I mean, I guess, there's plenty of people that will acknowledge like that genetics matter, but yeah, it tends to concentrate like in that marketplace. If you, I mean, people like look at Dave Asprey, right? Like you get a lot of followers sometimes by just making shit up, like or because things are so complicated that you can say something and kind of demonstrate it, but what you're demonstrating is something else. But it's just too like you just say like, oh yeah, it's good for you because it makes you feel good immediately after the thing, and
Yeah,
that's kind of the end of the demonstration. Um,
yeah. I have a good example of that. Like I can't remember what technology specifically this was for. I think it was like this guy who was like he was trying to get film studios to like film in like 60 frames per second, and he did like this scientific quote unquote scientific study that showed that when people were watching footage filmed in like 60 frames per second, they had like a higher heart rate. And so the idea was that it was more exciting.
mm,
And it's like it could that could there could be a lot of reasons why their heart rate is like, that's like the heart rate's like one of those like end measurements that like there's like so much data feeding into that one endpoint that yeah, it's really hard to say like one thing caused it or not.
Right. And even in this example we're talking about with like coffee and stuff, so if we think of coffee as maybe a sympathetic activator, like a sort of in the stress zone, and then you mix it with a meal that would be like a parasympathetic, like both a meal, which would be a parasympathetic stimulant, and then like a shock, a cold shower, a sympathetic stimulant, they both increase your heart rate.
Yeah, but they do it
So
kind of like through like different paths.
right, and in different signatures, and obviously with different long-term effects, and they have different lengths of
Yeah.
action. But if you just looked at like increased heart rate, I mean, yes.
Yeah. And so yeah, a lot of the keto carnivore people are they are seeing like those positive outcomes, but um probably taking kind of like the negative the sympathetic path instead of
Right.
the parasympathetic path.
Yes. No more sympathy. Put an end to sympathy. No more sympathetic. Um, I think that's all I had to say about coffee.
Yeah, that's about 45 minutes. I think I had some other things to talk about, but we can just bring those up on another show.
Okay.
So, yeah, have a good weekend.
Yeah, well, it's the week
Shut up.
now.